of the ANC, all of you that have been part is from all the provinces. We really appreciate that you have been holding the fort in these important issues. But again, Comrade Bandile is preparing now because we have agreed that there will be sort of a booklet that we do in terms of these topics that we're having, so that those that have missed the topics are in a position then to do some follow-ups in some of the discussions, and even because this is continuous program that we will be doing and the process that we'll be doing in reaching out to other comrades. I always call it's more of a movement that we've created of Umrabulo Thursdays, so that we don't forget of some of the things that has happened before and that are happening. But now, comrades, we have a new comrades that have joined us, and I know quite a number of people are interested in this topic here today, the rise and the fall of liberation movements in Southern Africa. And we are aware of what has been happening. And the follow up to this one, it's Comrade Bata at some stage, I think not this week, the week of in March, first week of March, around the 8th, we're not celebrating the International Women's Month, where she will be speaking then about, again, the role of us as women, which is power in terms of this rise and fall of liberation movements. So today, the comrade that is talking to us will just give us the highlights, and you all know him, Comrade Mkhari. I always say Comrade Mkhari because ngiyahluleka Mkhari ukubizela igama lakho. Amaxhosa ayazi basifakela amanye amagama we're not supposed to call your names. My apology, Mkhari, but it's not Comrade Given Mkhari. Some people were saying to me, oh, are you calling Given now? I said, no, it's not Given. It's not even Dr. Mkhari. This one, it's Mkhari on its own. We have his own track record. He has been working very closely with us in the organization, who have been part of our political school, especially our Tambo school. How I wish you should have listened to some of his sessions, but because today you are starting to listen to some of his sessions, those comrades that doesn't know him, you will hear the organization talking, the depth of what an organization is saying, and the comrade who understands the organization, especially including some of the international issues and the regional issues, as we call them, in the neighboring countries. I will hand over to you, Comrade Mkhari, so that you can take us through without wasting time. Then I will hand over to Comrade Tandi to chair, or Comrade Maggie, or any of our comrades in the political school. We do swap in terms of sharing, but Tandi is our constant sharing, as we always, he or she always lead even in the subcommittee and chair our sessions in our subcommittee. I'll hand over to you, Comrade Mkhari, with those few words that I've just highlighted. I didn't want to talk on this one. I wanted to listen. I didn't even want to go deeper in terms of the topic. I want to listen to what you will be saying. Then the other comrades will definitely make an input too in the discussions. And if there's something that it's written down, Comrade Mkhari will forward it to Sabelo at some stage so that we can share it with the comrades in the platform if it's there. If it's not there, you will just do a follow-up and give us, so that comrades can have a point of reference in your discussions. Thank you so much, comrades, for being part of this and for agreeing again. It has been very difficult of late for us. It's a topic on another time. Our comrades feels that we are not bringing everybody on board, and we're identifying comrades, critical comrades that must educate us on these topics. I always say, but there are those that are designed for specific topics. And again, we're giving women an opportunity, and men, I'm sure you have seen last week, it was a woman that was here. We're swapping them on purpose because we're trying to do this healthy competition amongst us and even motivate some of us to think like them. I always say that they may be the men or they may be women, but all of us, we must think the same. So that's why we always do this interchanging, so that we must think like them, we must copy them, we must walk the way they walk, we must talk the way they talk, we must do the research, which this morning I was in one conference that I was talking about. I was presenting a research paper that I've done, and other colleagues who have done some papers in the health-related space. But this is what you do. You have to learn. And in these sessions, we want to learn and unlearn, and at the same time, educate others to follow suit, because we can't have one or two individuals that can lead in the organization. But again, we're bringing in men and women of stature in the organization, with who have morals, we have ethics, we have commitment in this organization, because we are reviving and renewing the ANC. If we're not renewing the ANC, we'll segregate. That's why we will still bring male comrades to lead in these topics, because we want them to be part of us in terms of the challenges that we are experiencing and that we are facing. So with those few words, comrades, I'm handing over to Comrade Mkhari to lead us in the discussions today. Thank you so much. Comrade Tan.
Thank you very much, Comrade Nomantu. My name is Cde Kefentse Mkhari. Just a brief background about me. I joined the movement around 2014 through SASCO at Wits University, where I had the privilege and honor of leading different structures, including SASCO, as well as leading in student governance, including being the SRC president of Wits University in 2016, 2017. You would all remember that was during the time of Fees Must Fall. So we had the opportunity to lead and participate quite actively in the Fees Must Fall movement as children of the African National Congress. Of course, at the time, there were tensions, but we were still children of the African National Congress. I then joined the ANC officially around 2017 when I went back home in Hammanskraal, where I was born and bred at Wat 49, and proceeded again when now I had to go to Limpopo to transfer to Wat 32 in Mogalakwena, where I had the privilege of assisting the movement on various levels, including during elections as a BET member, got to lead the YCL in Governembeki, that is the Waterberg district in Limpopo. And in 2023, I joined the Wartambo School of Leadership as their communications, public relations and communications intern, of which 10 months later I was then promoted to be the manager of public relations and communications. And we've been since doing a lot of work with the school, including the Department of Political Education, since a decision was taken by the 55th National Congress that we need to reestablish that department as a full-time department as part of fast-tracking renewal. So we have been working with them, doing a number of things, including inductions, the rolling out of ANC Foundation courses, and other related work. So that is just a brief background about me. And of course, I'm a South African patriot. I love this country. I believe we are the best country in the world, despite the challenges that we have. So, comrades, today I've been invited here, and I feel it's such a great honor to be here. Let me begin by greeting the leadership of the Women's League, from national level up until to the various branches of the organization, the leadership of the ANC, NEC members who are present, and other leadership components of the structures of the ANC, from the national executive up until branch level, as well as other structures such as the ANC Youth League, Alliance Partners, the SACP, COSATU, SANCO, and the mass-brought democratic movement. I've been invited here, and it's such a great honor to be here and a great privilege to be given this opportunity to present on the rise and fall of liberation movements. So before I start, comrades, it's safe to say that I would like to start by making 3 disclaimers so that we can move together in this learning process. So my presentation, at the very most, it should take about 40 minutes, but I'll try to limited to 30 minutes to allow for engagements. The first disclaimer is that, comrades, I don't believe that, as the topic suggests, that there has been a rise and fall. I believe that there has been a rise, but the liberation movements are on a decline, but they have not completely fallen. The second disclaimer is that oftentimes when we speak about liberation movements, there's a narrative that speaks about them as former liberation movements. So I move from the premises that these are still liberation movements for two reasons. One is because we have not completed the task of liberation. And all of these liberation movements, or the parties that represent these liberation movements, are still in power. So they still control the state, and all of them recognize the state as an important path towards fulfilling the full objectives of the liberation. But secondly, because this notion of former liberation movements feeds into a narrative from the West in particular that seeks to vilify and demonize these liberation movements and try to claim that they have reached their expiry dates. Now, my third disclaimer is that I'm aware that I'm speaking to the Women's League, and perhaps many would have liked that in my presentation, I specifically emphasized the role that was played by women in what I'm going to speak about. Unfortunately, I did not do that because I did not want to speak on behalf of women. But secondly, the literature on the role that women have played in the liberation struggle is very thin. And therefore, as an outright recommendation is that the Women's League must do a lot of work in recording the role that women played in everything that we're going to speak about and streamlining it. And I'm glad that Comrade Nomantu spoke about that in her introduction, that at some point, Comrade Batabile will come and Mambatabile will come and speak about that role. But beyond just speaking about it, I think we need to make concerted efforts in streamlining that particular role so that when we speak about the liberation movements, particularly in Southern Africa, we're able to actually bring the role of women to the fore. With that said, comrades, I'll start with my presentation. So the starting point is that what are we speaking about when we speak about liberation movements? When we speak about the liberation movements, we are speaking about, sorry, let me just do this. So we are speaking about what is loosely called former liberation movements, which is composed of the 6 political parties in Southern Africa, which I'll speak about shortly. We are also speaking about the character of these 6 sister parties, which were African nationalist movements who were against colonialism and white minority rule in Southern Africa. And secondly, they all used Marxist-Leninist tools to defeat colonialism and apartheid and pursue a Pan-Africanist struggle. So what makes these 6 sister parties liberation movements and what distinguishes them from other parties is that they were nationalist movements, and I'll speak to why is that. But secondly, they all used Marxist-Leninist tools in their struggle against colonialism and apartheid. And thirdly, they were also pursuing a Pan-Africanist struggle in their struggle to defeat colonialism and apartheid. So these are the 6 sister parties that we speak of. The first one we all know is our glorious movement, the African National Congress, which is the oldest amongst them. And it took 82 years since the formation of the African National Congress until we got the democratic breakthrough in 1994. So from the ANC to South Africa today, it took us 82 years. The second one is TALU, TANU was a movement founded by Julius Nyerere, and they are not in any particular order. I've tried to put the order of their formations. So TANU was established by Julius Nyerere, and it took 10 years for it to negotiate independence for Tanzania, which was Tanganyika at the time. And then you know that 13 years later, there was a merger between TANU and the Afro-Shirazi party, which was responsible for the semi-autonomous islands of Zanzibar to form what we now know as Chama cha Mapinduzi. So from TANU, we had Tanzania, and then later on we had Chama cha Mapinduzi, which is a continuation of the work that was done by TANU and the Afro-Shirazi party. And then we have MPLA, which took about 19 years in a struggle for independent Angola. SWAPO, which took 30 years to independent Namibia. We have Frelimo, which took 13 years to independent Mozambique. Then we have ZANU-PF, which is also an amalgamation of two parties, took 17 years to get to independent Zimbabwe, which was former Rhodesia. So these are the six parties that form the liberation movements in Southern Africa. Now, what is the origins of these liberation movements? One is the nature of colonialism that took place in Southern Africa. We know that the African continent was colonized, but there was a particular colonialism that took place in Southern Africa, which was distinguishable from other forms of colonization and colonialism that took place in the continent and elsewhere in the world. And we had settler colonialism, which speaks to the fact that the European settlers or the colonizers established permanent homes, claiming land and political dominance. And this was most evident in South Africa, Namibia, Zimbabwe, and Angola, where the white minority governments entrenched systems of racial segregation and economic exploitation. The second factor that resulted out of that settler colonialism was racial capitalism. So from the discovery of minerals such as diamonds in the late 1600s and the discovery of gold in the mid 1800s resulted in the formation of capitalist mode of productions. So what happened is that out of that you had racial capitalism, where colonial economies were built on the forced labor of black populations, with mining, agriculture, and industry benefiting a white minority at the expense of the indigenous communities. And that's why today we're still even battling to deal with the legacy of apartheid, because of the inequalities that resulted out of that racial capitalism. The third aspect of the nature of colonialism in Southern Africa has to do with indirect rule. So in contrast to countries such as South Africa, Namibia, Zimbabwe, and Angola, countries like Botswana and Tanzania experience indirect rule, where colonial powers govern through local elites. This created different dynamic for their liberation movements, with a greater focus on political mobilization rather than armed resistance. So if you look at South Africa, Namibia, Zimbabwe, and Angola, and Mozambique, the armed struggles were more protracted because they had to deal head-on with colonial authorities who became in charge and established political dominance. Unlike in Tanzania, where the leadership in Botswana was more based on local authorities managing the affairs of the state, which were controlled from outside. Then the second thing that led to the liberation movements is land dispossession and apartheid. We all know about the issue of land dispossession. It's still a contentious issue even today when you speak about the Expropriation Act, which has been enacted this year, and the kind of backlash that we've been receiving internally and externally, or domestically and internationally. So across the region, land dispossession was a central grievance. White settlers seized fertile land, pushing black populations into impoverished reserves or homelands. This theft of land became a powerful rallying point for liberation movements, with promises of land redistribution and forming the core of their political platforms. That is why today, for example, when people are critical of the liberation movements, one of the things they feel the liberation movements have betrayed them on, it's on the issue of land, which is referred to as the original sin. We all know the Land Act of 1913 and later 1936, if my recollection is well, where in South Africa, for instance, white people took about 90% of the land, and only left about 10% for African people, and that still creates inequalities such as spatial inequalities, even the socio-economic inequalities that we are experiencing today are actually anchored on that land dispossession that occurred during colonization. And of course, segregation and apartheid. And then the third was the racist economic exploitation. I've already spoken about this, that there was an exploitation of black labor, in how the colonies established themselves. They established themselves on the backbone of economic exploitation. So those are the three reasons that led to the origins of former liberation movements. What was the character of these former liberation movements? Excuse me when I refer to former liberation movements every now and then, because the literature on liberation movement refers to them as former. So it's still on the tongue, but I think we all agree that these are still liberation movements. Is that one, they were nationalist in character due to the fact that settler colonialism and white minority rule was based on racism, right? I've spoken about how racial capitalism emerged out of that settler colonialism, the issue of segregation and apartheid. But secondly, they all used Marxist-Leninists or Marxist-Leninism as part of their ideological tools to analyze society and to wage their struggle. And this was in part to launch an offensive against imperialism and racist capitalistic exploitation, or if you like, racial capitalism, which was based on exploitation. Thirdly, they were Pan-Africanist. So the liberation movement also pursued a Pan-Africanist struggle, which then strengthened their solidarity and unity in action. So it wasn't just about defeating colonialism and apartheid, but it was also saying immediately after that, we must move towards realizing the ultimate Pan-Africanist ideal of a united, independent, and prosperous Africa. And that particular force of ideology is what actually strengthened their solidarity and unity in action. And this character and ideological posture of liberation movements was informed by the political and socio-economic material conditions imposed by settler colonialism, what we spoke about in the last slide. Now, what were the forms of struggle towards independence? One, you had partitions and deportations. We all know in the early stages of the formation of the African National Congress in particular, there were a lot of partitions and deportations. We know that people like Albert Tutuli, John Langalibalele Dube were on trips to Europe in order to partition on behalf of the African majority to be included in the establishment, at the time, the Union of South Africa in South Africa. And this was common in other countries. There were such partitions and deportations in one form or the other. The second was mass resistance and defiance campaign. So over time, mass mobilization and organization was deployed as a strategic tactic to intensify resistance through defiance campaigns and protests. We all know the 50s in particular, when we look at the history of the ANC, where this particular pillar was at its peak, was at its peak. I think it's Comrade Meg Maharaj who makes the point that at the beginning of the mass defiance campaigns, the ANC had about 8,000 members in total. And at some point, they were all arrested. But at the end of the defiance campaigns, or towards the end, as a result of the repressive nature in which the apartheid regime responded, the membership was at 100,000. That shows you the impact and the intents of the mass resistance and defiance campaigns. And of course, you had armed struggle and guerrilla warfare, where some of the liberation movements established military wings to wage armed struggle and guerrilla warfare. And I think the only party that did not really establish a military wing was TANU, because of the fact that they experienced a different kind of colonialism in the fact that theirs was more of an indirect rule. And then international solidarity, where concerted efforts were made to mobilize the international community to support our struggle against colonization and apartheid. What's important to note here is linked to my third disclaimer, that it's important to note that women organizations and movements played an important role in Africa's struggle for independence. So in everything that we've said here so far and what we're going to say moving forward, women have played an active role. And hence I made the appeal that we need to bring those roles to the fore, because they are often marginalized when we account for the history of liberation movements. So what were the military wings and how was the armed struggle conducted? So with the ANC, you had Umkhonto Wesizwe. This is the ANC's armed wing established in 1961, which adopted sabotage tactics against key infrastructure. Those are the guerrilla warfare tactics that were adopted. It received military training and weapons from the Soviet Union and other Eastern Bloc countries. The movement faced violent opposition from the South African Defence Force and internal groups like the Pan-Africanist Congress Armed Wing Poto. In SWAPO, you had the People's Liberation Army of Namibia, PLAN. PLAN was formed in 1966. It launched a guerrilla warfare from the bases in Angola and Zambia. South Africa's occupation forces responded with counter-insurgency tactics. SWAPO received significant military aid from Cuba and the Soviet Union. Then ZANU-PF, you had the Zimbabwean African National Liberation Army, ZANLA. ZANLA, backed by mainly China, focused on rural guerrilla warfare. It often clashed with Zebra forces. These are the Zimbabwean People's Revolutionary Army, the armed wing of ZAPU, which is the Zimbabwe African People's Union, leading into internal fierce rivalries. So they were rivals in a sense. And we'll show how that rivalry play out in the context of the Cold War as we go on with the presentation. And MPLA had People's Armed Forces of the Liberation of Angola, FAPLA, which relied heavily on Soviet and Cuban support during its struggle against the Portuguese army and later fought against UNITA, which was backed by the US and apartheid South Africa in the post-independence war. So we'll again come back to this issue of the rivalries so that we can contextualize them within the Cold War and the imperialist forces who were still trying to gain control even post-independence. Frelimo, you had the Mozambican Liberation Front Army. Frelimo fought for a decade long against Portuguese forces, drawing support from the Soviet Union and China. Also, there were internal rivalries or internal splits, which led to the emergence of Renamo, a rebel group backed by Rhodesia and apartheid South Africa. Then in Tanzania or Tanganyika at the time, CCM, you had TANU, which I spoke about. Through TANU struggle, though TANU struggle was largely non-violent, it supported regional liberation armies by providing training camps and logistical support and becoming an ally for neighboring movements. So as I said, with Tanzania or former Tanganyika, the situation was different. Theirs was not a protracted armed struggle. It was more of a political mobilization and negotiation type of struggle, but they played a huge role in supporting and creating bases for the liberation arms of the other parties. Now, the Cold War dynamics and impact, and I think this is very important because it brings the issue of global balance of forces into the fore. And maybe this particular section can even help us understand some of the global dynamics that we are dealing with currently. So the Cold War profoundly influenced the political and armed struggles of liberation movements in Southern Africa as the region became a battleground for competing global ideologies. So the region has always been a competing ground for global ideologies, right? In particular, the communist socialist ideologies versus liberalism and capitalism views. So the Soviet Union and Eastern blocs, the Soviet Union along with Cuba and Eastern Europe countries provided military training, arms, and financial aid to liberation movements. I think that was quite clear in the previous slides. The ANC received support from Umkhonto weSizwe, strengthening its sabotage campaigns against apartheid. SWAPO's plan operated from bases in Angola and Zambia, bolstered by the Soviet-supplied arms and Cuban military advisors. You would remember even in the Battle of Quinto Cornovali in Angola, where Cuba and the Soviet Union actually pledged their military personnel as part of supporting our liberation struggle against South African occupying forces at the time. MPLA forces rallied heavily on Soviet and Cuban troops during Angola's war for independence and the subsequent civil war. That is the war in Quinto Cornovali that I spoke about, and the wars that took place between MPLA and UNITA. Frelimo's anti-Portuguese resistance received weapons and training from both the Soviet Union and China. And then in terms of the role of China, China provided military training and arms to Zanla, that is the military, the military arm of ZANU-PF, and armed the wing of ZANU-PF. Chinese support aimed at counterbalancing Soviet Union influence in the region, fueling a rivalry between Zanla and Zebra forces. Remember at the time, there was a question of yellow communists, which was referred to the Chinese. They were seen as not purely communists, and they were referred to as yellow communists. So there's also been those divisions within the Marxist-Leninist bloc, you know, where some people felt, in particular, China was not pure communist in a way, and that's what this point is trying to make when it says that Chinese support was aiming to counterbalance Soviet influence in the region. Then the United States and Western allies, fearing the spread of communism, that's why today we speak of a concept that was influenced by Afrikaner nationalists called Roy Gafar, which was really scared about the spread of communism. The USA and its allies supported colonial governments and rival factions opposing Soviet-aligned movements. The US and apartheid South Africa backed UNITA in Angola to counter MPLA's growing strength. Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe, received covert support from the West in its fight against Zanla and Zebra. Then South Africa also played a role because it was siding with the USA. Hence, I spoke about the Roy Gafar and Swart Gafar ideologies that emerged in the African nationalist bloc. The apartheid regime acted as a regional enforcer of Western interest, launching cross-border raids into Angola, Mozambique, and Zambia to crush liberation movements. And then even in other countries, in Swaziland, in Lesotho, in Botswana, there were such raids which were done by SADF in trying to counter the influence of liberation movements, in particular against the ANC, which was more intense. It also supported Renamo in Mozambique and UNITA in Angola as proxies to destabilize MPLA and Frelimo. So remember that UNITA was trying to destabilize and manage the influence of the MPLA, whereas Renamo was fighting against Frelimo and trying to manage their influence. And of course, this emerged in proxy wars and destabilization, where the Cold War turned Southern Africa into a proxy battle, if you think about it, because people like Renamo, UNITA, were actually proxies for the United States and its Western allies, whereas liberation movements were more aligned to the Soviet Union bloc. Angola's civil war, which took place in 1975 up until 2002, saw direct intervention by Cuban troops on the MPLA side and the apartheid South Africa on UNITA side. I've already unpacked that. Mozambique faced a brutal insurgency by Renamo aimed at undermining Frelimo's socialist government. Namibia's struggle for independence was drawn into the Cold War politics, with South Africa occupying the country and plan fighting back with Soviet and Cuban support. So you would remember even post-independence, and I think President Beki yesterday, when he was giving a eulogy in President Sam Yoma's memorial service, alluded to this, that even during the negotiations, the South African military intelligence tried as much as possible to sort of fight against the influence of SWAPO as a legitimate movement that people rallied behind. Even during the elections, they actually interfered. And that's what led to SWAPO getting around 50-something% in the first elections, despite the high voter turnout. Is because the South African military intelligence was actually supporting and financing forces that were against SWAPO or were used to neutralize SWAPO's dominance. We also experienced the same thing during negotiations. You'd remember the whole Inkatha issue versus the ANC, where the apartheid government was arming Inkatha people. And that's why even today in KZN, you still have an issue of guns and shootouts, to resolve political differences. It's because the apartheid military intelligence worked with Inkatha to neutralize the ANC's influence. And we all know how that tried to disrupt the CODESA issue. And thanks to the leadership we had at the time, that we're able to regroup and forge ahead with the negotiated settlements. Another important part that is important to speak about, which signifies the the strong solidarity that was there amongst the liberation movements is the frontline states, which emerged in 1970 as a coalition of African nations supporting the liberation of Southern Africa from colonial and white minority rule. Led initially by Tanzania, Zambia, and Botswana, the coalition expanded to include Angola, Mozambique, and Zimbabwe after their independence. The objectives of the frontline states was to provide sanctuary and logistical support to liberation movements, to coordinate diplomatic pressure against apartheid South Africa and colonial regimes, to strengthen economic cooperation, and to reduce dependence on South Africa, as apartheid South Africa at the time. You'd remember, for example, when South Africa sort of interrupted the logistical paths of Namibia and Zimbabwe. What had happened at the time was that they were trying to sort of, in a way, impose sanctions that would not allow goods to move from Namibia to other parts of the continent. The government of Tanzania, for example, intervened by building a railway line that moves straight from Zimbabwe, I think, to Zambia. So they actually created a railway path that was able to circumvent the efforts of the apartheid government. I'm just forgetting where that railway started and stopped. But those were the practical solidarity initiatives that were undertaken to ensure that there is enough support for the liberation movements, even post-independence. Because, for example, Namibia suffered a lot because we were still negotiating our independence when they had gotten their independence in 1990. Mozambique also suffered. Many countries that received independence before us suffered as a result of supporting our struggle. And then the other thing was military and logistical support. So frontline states offered safe havens for guerrilla fighters, allowing movements like the ANC, SWAPO, and ZANLA to establish military training camps and plan operations. You would know in Tanzania, for example, we were in Morogoro, we were in the region of Bagamoyo, and that's where in Morogoro you have the SOMAFCO, the Solomon Mahlangu College, and you also had the military training camp. You'd know that we were hosted in Lusaka, and we had camps all over these frontline states. So, for example, Zambia hosted SWAPO's planned fighters. Mozambique became a base for Zimbabwe's ZANLA forces. The other thing was on the issue of diplomatic pressure. The frontline states played a crucial role in rallying the international community against apartheid. They lobbied the United Nations, they lobbied the Organization of African Unity and Western countries pushing for sanctions against South Africa and Rhodesia. For example, you had the African National Congress as a banned political party, having observer status at the United Nations and being able to make submissions in some of the meetings of the United Nations as a result of the diplomatic pressure that was applied by the frontline states. And of course, on economic strategies, yes, this is the railway that I was speaking about, that the Tazara railway between Tanzania and Zambia was a vital route of bypassing South African controlled ports. You know, like, for example, the ones in Namibia, some in Rhodesia, and so forth and so on. So these are some of the practical things that were done as part of expressing that solidarity with the liberation movements by the frontline states. And of course, there were challenges, and some of the challenges that were faced had to do with the intense pushback from apartheid South Africa and its Western allies, including cross-border rails and military attacks, sabotage and economic destabilization, the internal conflicts and fracturing of the liberation movements, particularly the armed wings that I spoke about, when they backed rebel groups such as UNITA and Renamo, even post-independence. The legacy of the frontline states is that the collective efforts of the frontline states were vital in isolating the apartheid regime, supporting liberation movements, and accelerating the collapse of colonial and white minority rule in Southern Africa. Now, all of these countries had negotiated settlements. Because sometimes when we speak about a negotiated settlements, particularly in the context of South Africa, we tend to think that it's a unique thing to South Africa, you know? And part of what resulted in this negotiated settlement is the fact that beyond the protracted struggle that these liberation movements actually undertook against colonial and white minority rule, is that in the 80s, there was the collapse of the Soviet Union, which had a serious impact on the strength of the liberation movements. So when you had the colonial and apartheid regimes being weakened as a result of the efforts of the protracted struggle, we were also significantly weakened by the collapse of the Soviet Union. And that's why it was not possible to actually say, let's take it by the barrel of the gun. We had to go and negotiate. And of course, that collapse had other significant implications, which resulted even in the challenges that we experienced post-gaining independence. So the transition from armed struggles to political power for liberation movements in Southern Africa often required complex negotiated settlements. These agreements laid the foundation for independence, democracy, and in some cases, an easy peace. So we'll look at it country by country just to get a sense. So in South Africa, you had the Convention for Democratic South Africa, CODESA, negotiations which began in 1991. Out of that, you had a multi-party agreement which was reached in 1993, leading to the first democratic elections in 1994. The ANC negotiated a government of national unity with the National Party, ensuring a peaceful transition from apartheid to democracy. And maybe a point to make here, comrades, is that, of course, there is a feeling that we compromised a lot during negotiations. And maybe that's a conversation that we must have to really look at whether or not the compromises that were made were extensive or they were fair enough given the moment and the time. And some of those compromises, for me, they were necessary because when you are negotiating in the process of what we call conflict resolution, because if you look at these negotiations, in part, they were conflict resolutions processes which wanted to ensure the transfer of power. There are things that you have to do as confidence builders to keep the parties at the table, to keep the parties negotiating. For example, the contentious issue that arose at the 1991 conference in Durban around the issue of sanctions, whether we should support the lifting of sanctions as a show of good faith, was a very contentious issue. And in fact, if you go and look at the documentary of that conference, that was one of the most heated commissions, which was led by former President Thabo Mbeki. Comrade Ronnie Carroll makes the point that actually I also did not support the lifting of sanctions, but I was convinced by the arguments that were made by former President Thabo Mbeki as to why it was important to lift those sanctions as part of confidence building. So some of these compromises, such as the sunset clause, came as a result of confidence building and ensuring that you keep people on the table. And we can discuss on another day whether those compromises were too much or they were sufficient. In Namibia, you had the tripartite agreement of 1988, which involved South Africa, Angola, and Cuba, leading to the withdrawal of South African troops from Namibia. You had Resolution 435, which provided a framework for free elections held in 1989. President Sam Yoma played a huge role in negotiating that particular resolution. I think if you go and listen to that memorial service, former President Thabo Mbeki makes reference to this. And then SWAPO won the elections, leading Namibia to independence in 1990. In Zimbabwe, you had the Lancaster House Agreements in 1979, which ended the Rhodesian Bush War. It set a stage for the 1980 elections in which Robert Mugabe's ZANU-PF emerged victorious. The agreement ensured a temporary protection of white minority land rights and a contentious issue, which was a contentious issue later on, around the issue of land grabs and, Tony Blair in particular, Margaret Thatcher at the time, the Prime Minister of UK, not meeting some of the terms of the agreements, which led to the hostile takeover of land later in Zimbabwe. In Angola, you had the Alvo Agreement of 1975, which granted Angola independence from Portugal. However, there was a civil war that broke out between MPLA, UNITA, and the armed wing of MPLA, which was exacerbated by the Cold War dynamics, which I spoke about. And then in 1991, you had the Beces Accords in an attempt to end the conflict, leading to the elections in 1992 through fighting, although fighting resumed shortly after. I think it resumed up until 2002. In Mozambique, you had the Lusaka Accord of 1974, which secured Mozambique's independence from Portugal. You had the post-independence civil war that erupted between Frelimo and Renamo. We've spoken about the dynamics that led to that. Then you had the Rome General Peace Accords of 1992, formally ending the war, paving the way for multi-party elections in 1994. Then Tanzania, which was a unique case, while not emerging from an armed struggle, CCM, formerly TANU, I've spoken about that transition from TANU to CCM, played a vital role in supporting other liberation movements. Tanzania gained independence through peaceful negotiations with Britain in 1961. Under Julius Nyerere, the country acted as a hub for liberation movements, offering military training and diplomatic backing. Tanzania played a very huge role in the liberation struggle of Southern Africa. In fact, when I was in Tanzania last year at the Mwalimu Julius Nyerere Leadership School, Dr. Charles Mobito of SWAPO makes the point that, in fact, for Limo was conceptualized and formally established in Tanzania before it went back to establish base in Cabo Delgado in Mozambique. It was conceptualized in Tanzania. And we all know they were all housed there in Kongwa, I think, in the Bagamoyo region. We even got to see the house where former President Samora Machel stayed with other leaders of the liberation movements. What were the strengths at independence? And I'm moving towards closure. These organizations were mass-based organizations. They had a glorious history. They had strong, tried and tested leadership. I mean, if you look at that leadership that ushered us into independence, it was a very strong, tried and tested leadership. We are speaking about people like President O.R. Tambo, President Nelson Mandela, President Sam Nujoma, President Julius Nyerere, President Kenneth Kaunda. Mugabe at the time also was a renowned leader. Of course, later on we can debate his legacy, but I don't think there's any leader who does not have a contested legacy. There were legitimate governing parties. they had strong ties amongst themselves, which I'm not so sure they are still strong because of some of the objective challenges that we'll speak about later. There was a renewed sense of hope amongst the masses at that point of independence, and there was a heightened sense of Pan-Africanism. For example, you had this African Renaissance philosophy emerging quite strongly. But what were the immediate challenges that they had to encounter at independence? Upon gaining independence, liberation movements faced a new set of challenges as they shifted from resistance to governance. One had to do with economic fragility. Colonial powers left behind economies designed to benefit settlers with minimal infrastructure to support national development. I think President Beki also makes this point at the launch of the book ANC Today. He says when they entered into the union building, literally they had to start from scratch in terms of establishing state institutions and other key institutions that were meant to serve the people and broaden services. Countries like Mozambique and Angola inherited economies devastated by sabotage and war, political instability. New independent states struggled to unite factions within liberation movements, leading to internal power struggles. In Angola and Mozambique, rival factions backed by Cold War superpowers triggered civil wars. We've spoken about that. There were also security concerns. Former colonial and apartheid regimes like South Africa continue to destabilize neighboring states by supporting insurgent groups, like the ones that were spoken about in the form of Renamo and UNITA. There were ethnic and regional divisions. In Zimbabwe, tensions between ZANU-PF and ZAPU persisted, leading to violent crackdowns like the Gukurangundi massacre. I think this is the massacre that had to do with the people in Matebele land, and you can read on that. Perhaps my pronunciation is not correct there because it's written in Shona. The issue of land restitution redistribution took a slow pace. Promises to reclaim land from white settlers often clashed with legal protections built on negotiated settlements, as seen in Zimbabwe's delayed land reforms. And even South Africa is a case in this point, to say we're still far behind in terms of land redistribution, or if we want to be quite emphatic in addressing the original sin of land dispossession. And then what are the subjective challenges that started emerging over time as these parties started governing? I think one of them had to do with transitioning from being liberation movements who were in the trenches into electioneering political parties, because that brought new dynamics that perhaps we were not ready for. The question of the sins of incumbency, which have to do with corruption, state capture, maladministration, the embezzlement of funds, and the many things that have become serious contentious issues in the discourse of the societies in which we lead. Toxic factional battles and infightings, which can be seen in the splinter groups. In our case, you've had the splinter of the UDF, you had COPE, you had the EFF, and most recently, we have the MKP. And in other countries, these splinter groups are there as well. Another challenge has to do with the failure to translate quantitative growth into qualitative substance. So, for example, because we transitioned into political parties which need majority support to stay in power, we started attracting more members into our ranks, but we did not sufficiently train those members into qualitative substance, or if you like, into cadres who were able to represent what the organization stood for and what it seeks to achieve. So in fact, the translation that you have had from quantity to quality is a mass of these untrained members who join into the party, some of them with nefarious reasons, translating the qualitative character of the organizations into what it's not. So you started seeing rapacious elements emerging because there were more and more people who were just entering but were not trained. And they thought certain things are right to do. And you had more and more of those things that were wrong being done, such that today, when you speak about the NC, for instance, it's referred to as a corrupt party, simply because the quantity to quality translation that has happened has been negative. And that's why today we speak about mass political education as one of the key pillars of renewal, because we want to reverse that negative translation into a positive one. And of course, that led to the erosion of core values, principles, and ethics. Another issue has to do with the generational disconnect. For example, if you look at voter sentiment, particularly among young people towards liberation movements, it's negative, right? Young people are struggling to relate with how our parties are structured, how they are organized, and the people that are leading them. And I think this is something that we really, really need to work on, to say, how do you get this generation of AMA 2000 into the ranks of the movement and be able to conscientize them in a way that they would understand what these movements stands for and what they seek to achieve. And of course, with that came the issue of lack of service delivery, because we are governing parties. There are public services and goods that are expected that we must deliver. So with all of the things above, it led to the erosion of our capability to deliver services at the right time and at the right quality. Attached to this objective challenges. And I think the first of objective challenges has to do with neo-colonial and neoliberal dominance. And part of this is as a result of that collapse of the Soviet Union in the 80s, because we had to suspend our socialist outlook at some point, trying to alleviate the fears from other parts of the world so that we are not isolated simply because of our socialist outlook. And what that has done is that it has entrenched neo-colonialism and neoliberalism in our economies and how they are supposed to run. And of course, for the longest time, particularly with that collapse again, you had a unipolar world that politically and socio-economically disadvantages Africa. And that's why today, as part of the reforms that we're calling for, we want to strive for a multipolar world that will be advantageous to our own strategic endeavors. That came with the influence of the Bretton Woods institutions on African government and economies, with the issue of conditionalities, aid and loans that came with conditionalities, the issues of the structural adjustment plans of the 80s and how they actually led to the economic dispossession of our countries post-independence. And in all of that, you see the scramble of Africa re-emerging. Of course, more complex, more sophisticated, but nonetheless still a scramble for Africa in terms of the extractive economies that still define the economic structures of most of our countries, with Western powers and other powers in the East extracting minerals from Africa. So we remain a resource-rich, minerally rich continent, but economically poor, because our economies are still based on that extractive model of doing things, which continues the colonial legacy and apartheid legacy. Persistent conflicts and wars on the African continent. The issue of brain drain, I think it's also important, because what you have is that the more and more our economies are stagnating and failing, you have the intellectual talent of Africa migrating from Africa into other parts of the world, particularly in Europe. And then, of course, the slow pace of technological developments, perhaps led by the brain drain that I've spoken about. And here we can speak about the recent electoral outcomes, which shows the impact of those objective and subjective challenges, but I won't go to this because of time. What are the implications for democracy now? You have the masses that are buying out of democracy. We're seeing statistics that shows us that election after election, more and more people, especially young people, are staying away from the polls, which means that more and more people are losing confidence in the democratic order and the Republican idea, progressive Republican idea, which is underpinned by the Freedom Charter in South Africa. You have disillusionment and despondency. Masses are frequently becoming disillusioned and despondent, which enlarges the mistrust between the people and government authorities, which leads to political instability and conflicts. You can see in Mozambique, every time elections are held, there's contestation. In Zimbabwe, we had a similar case. So the disillusionment and despondency leads to political instability and conflicts. The resurgence of military coups in the Sahel and the Western African region. And I think this is important, is an important issue that we must concern ourselves with, because it may in a way come to us. It may in a way come to us. I mean, if you listen to some of the sentiment around this issue with our fallen soldiers in the Eastern DRC and some of the sentiment that is emerging. If you look at the issues in Mozambique, if you look at some of the issues in Zimbabwe, you can see that the ground is starting to become fertile for the possibility of military coups. It may not be as pronounced, but it's an issue that we need to concern ourselves with and ensure that we don't get to that stage. And of course, you have expanding foreign interference. This interference comes in many forms: the NGOs, civil society space, the elections, observer missions. There's a lot of interference. The interference by intelligence services in creating instability in the forms of rebel groups, in the forms of supporting those who are anti-establishment, so forth, so on. An issue that we need to concern ourselves with, especially in South Africa. When you look at this issue of the heightened migration into South Africa and our porous borders, we need to really look into this issue, because there may be issues of counter-revolution attached to the influx of foreign nationals that are coming into our country. I mean, some years back, we're speaking about South Africa financing terrorist groups such as ISIS. So this is an issue we really need to concern ourselves with, especially as the Women's League, because women and children are the most affected in cases of instability and conflicts. And overall, it means that democracy and constitutional republicanism are under threat. So my last slide, comrades, what is the way forward? The way forward is that these liberation movements need to renew and rebuild, all of them without exception. And we all know that in the African National Congress, this is an important issue. If you look at the January 8th statement and the outcomes of the NEC Lekotla, you'll see that this issue is impressed upon quite significantly. In fact, in our priorities for this year is the number one priority. Secondly, we need to develop new evidence-based paradigms of development. I think we need to free ourselves from this neo-colonial, neoliberal framework of development. We need to create new paradigms of development. How do we measure our developmental goals? How do we craft them? What are those goals, right? So that we can get out of this neoliberal thinking that I think disadvantages us. You know, many analysts are starting to speak about the question of heterodox economics. How do we use those heterodox economics to develop new frameworks for our own development? Cadre development, very important. In fact, both the Lekgotla and the ANC say cadre development is an important pillar for renewal. We must allow young, capable people to take up space. And I know this is a contentious issue because it's very contentious because sometimes when we speak about it, especially as young people, we only speak about it from a point of age. And I don't think that's enough. We need young, capable people who will inspire confidence. And it therefore means that we must develop those young people and allow them to take space. Fifthly, I think it's important, comrades, to set higher standards for political leadership. We might want to look at this question of democracy versus the standards of leadership, because I think it's over time, and this is my view, emphasizing on liberal democracy within our structures and within our movements has eroded the quality of leadership, because the more and more we emphasize liberal democracy in particular, the more and more our standards for leadership, political leadership in particular, go lower. So we might want to find mechanisms that will set higher standards for political leadership. And we need to develop activists and thought leaders. I think we've regressed a bit on that front of activism and thought leadership, which we need to bring back, particularly within the ANC Women's League, because more and more young women are getting education, but unfortunately, the frame of mind or the ideologies which underpin the education that they're getting, it's inimical to what we're trying to achieve. It's inimical to the objectives of the NDR. So we need to conscientize and draw more young people into the ranks of the Women's League. But also it's important because women are the biggest beneficiaries and participators in democratic processes. I mean, if women did not come out in the numbers that they did in the last elections, would probably be far worse off than we are in terms of the electoral outcome. So, comrades, I conclude here with this quote from Through the Eye of the Needle, which I shall not explain through time, I'll just read out, to say all of the things that we have spoken about require leadership. And it's important for us to realize that there are no ready-made leaders. Leaders evolve out of the battles for social transformation. In these battles, cadres will stumble and some will fall. But the abiding quality of leadership is to learn from mistakes, to appreciate one's weaknesses and correct them. A leader should seek to influence and be influenced by others in the collective. He or she should have the conviction to state his or her views boldly and openly within constitutional structures of the movement, and without being disrespectful, not cower before those in more senior positions in pursuit of patronage, nor rely on cliques to maintain one's position. I think I would leave it at there. Thank you very much, Comrade Nomantu and comrades, for your attention. I'm sorry I went over time, but I think it was important to emphasize some of the issues in the presentation. Thank you very much.
Good evening, comrades. My name is Fuyiwe Ani, a member of the subcommittee, Political Education Subcommittee. I'll be standing in for Comrade Tandi, as we all know that she's the standing chairperson of our sessions. Let me start by greeting our presenter, Comrade Mkhari, thanking you for availing yourself when the Women's League asked you. We're thanking you for this topic because it's very close to our heart. Thank you for the insightful, reviving, and comprehensive presentation. And let me greet our chairperson also, the convener of the subcommittee, Comrade Nomantu Nkomo Ralihoko. Greetings to you also, formerly Comrade Mkhari. And I would like to extend special greeting to our leaders, whom I've noticed in the platform. We are always happy to see you supporting us. We always appreciate your presence in our midst. I've noticed Comrade Pemima Jordina, who is also an NEC of the Women's League member. Comrade Batabile Dlamini, who has just left. Her apologies accepted. She had to leave earlier. Also, I saw Comrade Lindiwe Zulu, and apologies to other NEC members whom I didn't notice or acknowledge. It's not intentional. I further greet everyone present. And now mine is just to share the session, allow comrades to have inputs, comment, discuss, and ask questions. I will allow only 3 minutes for speakers. So I will allow you, comrades, to raise your hand who are interested to speak. So I would also encourage and ask comrades to please stick to the 3 minutes maximum. At this moment, I see two hands. I will start with those 2 hands, and I'm sure as time goes on, we will also get other hands. You allow anyone, even if it's clarity in the input, or you want to comment or discuss. Or at least I can see now we've got 1, 2, 3, 4. So I will start with Comrade Onwabile Lupelwane. Over to you, Comrade Onwabile.
Thank you very much, Chair. Firstly, I want to appreciate the ANC Women's League for having arranged us for such an important discussion. It's a very relevant one. But to go straight to the point, and thanks, Comrade Kefentse, for a precise presentation. I want to start on a few issues which obviously may also sound controversial, but are worth saying. And these are just opinions of Onwabile. And amongst those, for me, is when I trace back part of the problems which may be leading us to a collapse today, in my personal view, includes Comrade Mkhari, the deputations, those trips to London, trips to the Western world and Europe. I think our comrades, they did very well to mobilize globally to ensure that the ANC comes back with liberation. But also they came back with very problematic things as legacies. One of those is the common law of this country, the Roman-Dutch hybrid, which informs our common law today in our constitution. It is my view that it exists to protect settler interests. It is my view that the uncodified customary law is part of the tensions which exist amongst those who are elected and those who are born leaders, Amakos. And there's parties formed on that question precisely. And part of the conflict is that there's no proper synergy, which makes the ANC government to look like it governs on behalf of whites And to take it a bit deeper, you know, there's systems like the PR system. If you check their origins in Athens and how they came about, these are foreign practices to African, which exist to really protect the interest of minorities, to ensure that even if there are few emphakathini, they still end up leading one way or the other. And this also extends to rules of engagements, the rules of the economy, the rules of trade are informed by this common law, which is foreign to us. The most developed nations are using indigenous laws, including, you know, the Chinese, the Russians. So, just to leave this point, I also want to talk to examples of the Sandinista Liberation Front, the lessons there. Those comrades, they lost power. And they sat down and said, why did you lose power? And they began to improve on those items. This includes having law that talks to the needs of their people, having policies that talk to the direct interests of the people they lead. In this country, you've got a South Africa, which is increasingly collapsing industry. When you industrialize, collapse manufacturing. For example, where I grew up in Alexandra, all those factories, then Marlboro, Weinberg, going down towards Jamestown, some of them are closed, and those people are not working. And those factories are now squatter camps. How could the ANC allow that? And these are the things that allow a collapse of an ANC government. And these are the things that, if you learn across African nations, liberation movements lose popularity because a majority becomes unemployed. A majority becomes a discontent. But also another important part of this, Comrade Mkhari, as you said correctly, is the schism of generation. The refusal by liberators to retire, where who are not going home to retire, whom can't communicate with our peers, whom AMA 2000, as you said correctly, cannot correctly link with them or the policies. And when they view them on TV, the youth becomes an insult, that the youth is a majority, is supposed to be providing solutions, but we are led by old people. So that is also a problem. Actually, when we were doing door-to-door, the big sentiment, even amongst old people, is that why are they not going home, these guys? Also, the other important thing is the collapse of support due to patronage networks and factions. An ANC member today is more of a commodity of a faction and a network of patronage, as compared to being a genuine activist who rises on the occasion of activism and is able to solve ingxenye zomphakathi wakhe. Also, the most important thing that we face as a country is the disloyalty to the regime. And this is owed to various other issues which I've made in my notes, but I can't raise them because of time. So this lack of patriotism is owed to corruption, is owed to nepotism. You know, you've got, like now, you've got unemployed doctors who complain that how can we as frontline workers and teachers be unemployed when we are contributing the most skills and crucial skills into the economy? This may mean that the economy has been mismanaged to the extent whereby you've got to be cutting budget and not being able to afford to hire some of the most important skills.
Comrade Onwabile, sorry to disturb, try and wrap up. The 3
Done,
minutes.
thank you.
Now wrap up, comrade.
No, I've summarized my points in that way. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Comrade Onwabile. Comrade Pito.
No, thank you very much for the opportunity and revolutionary greetings, comrades. And I want to say that big ups to the Women's League for affording us this opportunity to dissect some of the issues that we face on a daily basis. And I want to welcome the presentation by the presenter, a very thought-provoking presentation. And yeah, let me join the queue on commentary on the presentation. And I think I want to highlight two historical times that happened here on South Africa, you know. And I don't mean to regurgitate the history lesson. I want to base my input on that lesson, history lesson. Well, the first one would be, and I want to make a disclaimer also that I'm not promoting any tribe, you know, on my commentary right now. The first one is of I want to comment the then the Moshweshwe people, you know, the people of Lesotho for bravery and for the stand that they took in the times of the fights, of the battles that they had to enjoy, you know, at the height of apartheid, at the height of colonialism, at the height of occupation. And if you, at that height, if you resisted, I mean, all you had to face was a baptism of fire all the way, you know. So, but I want to commend them because they held their own at that time, and at the place of Tababusi, they held their own there, and they resisted, and I think, in my view, this is my view, and I think they held their own, and at that fight, at least I could say they had something to write home about in terms of that battle. And the other one that I want to highlight very quickly is of the Voortrekker battle between the Zulu tribe and the Afrikaner, if I'm not mistaken. That battle was a gruesome battle that led to, I mean, it was the English, if I'm not mistaken. Sorry for that. I think that battle was a very a gruesome battle that they had to face, and I mean, imagine you having a spear and a shield, only a shield against a gun. I mean, you wouldn't stand a chance, but they stood their ground. And what I'm trying to say is that, I mean, the liberation movement made us to be where we are right now. And if it was not of the African National Congress, I think the point in time where we find ourselves in, we wouldn't be where we are if it was not of ANC. I think we must pat ANC on the back, or because of the things that ANC did for us to be in the constitutional democracy that we find ourselves in. And I mean,
Hey.
right now, the ANC is a social fiber in our society. You'll find that you can say that the soul of the ANC rests among the community, the society. You'll find it there, because when problems, when social ills emerge in the society, you'll find ANC there trying to resolve the issues that are there and the problems that are there. So I agree with the presenter when he said on the beginning that there is the rise of the liberation, but the fall is, no, I agree with him. It's only the decline, and I want to emphasize on
Thank you.
on the
Comrade Tito.
decline. Chairperson, I think you
Comrade
are,
Tito.
yes,
Will
as
you?
a wrap up, but Chair, be fair, because the first participant, you afforded him an ample time. Be fair,
Order
Chair.
no. Respect the chair.
Comrade Tito, yours
Order.
is 6 minutes now. Yours is 6 minutes.
Okay,
We started at half
okay.
past.
As I wrap up, no, as I wrap up, what I'm saying is that the ANC, we are who we are because of the ANC, and yes, I was saying that the decline, I think it's the paintings upon us, and if we want to ourselves at the glorious movement that we once had, I think we need to work the ground. We need to do the basics. We need to do the deliverables that we did once upon a time when we were at majority, you know. So I think I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Comrade Pizzo. Over to you, Comrade Pemi.
Thank you very much, Comrade Chair, our convener of Political Education of Committee, Comrade Nomantu. Let me also greet NEC members of the Women's League, the NEC members of the African National Congress, leaders on this platform. Thank you very much, comrades. Comrade Kefentse, thank you so much for taking us back where we come from. And I fully agree with you that there is no fall of the liberation movement, and we are not former liberation movement. I think you have contextualized that very well. But I think the challenge that we had is that after we received our liberation, we did not rally the society to understand what governance is all about. We left them to maneuver on their own. Hence, they use the same tactics that we were using when we had a government that did not listen to us, a government that we could not engage anywhere. Comrade Kefentse, I think you will appreciate the fact that this is the platform of the ANC Women's League. Maybe next time when we invite you again, please characterize the role of women in MK. Comrade Lindy Zulu, I'm happy she's here, a well-trained soldier of our movement, to say what role did women play in terms of the guerrilla warfare, because that comes very, 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 very light when ANC male comrades are making input. So it's just a constructive criticism, but maybe the topic did not allow you to go to that extent. I'm making a call to Comrade Nomantu and the team that she's working with, that come August, I think we must get that perspective of the women in MK. Then the other thing that I think we should also do is how do we characterize these splinter groups? You talked about Renamo, which was a splinter group. You talked about UNITA, which was a splinter group. They became rebels. They became those splinter groups that were anti-government, and they did all what they've done in those countries. How do we then characterize this splinter group of yesterday, the splinter group that called itself MK Party? Because some of them, some not all, some of them are trained soldiers. Some of them, rightfully so, they are former MK members. So how do we see them as? Do you see them as a threat that might become organized rebels in our country? As I round off, Chair, I want to respect you and the 3 minutes. When we took over the state, we inherited huge debt. Hence, today, the demand for service delivery, we are unable to meet the demands, because as we took over, what we were not aware of was that what was that we're inheriting. We inherited a huge debt, and today, when we talk about debt and economy that is not growing, it's not because it started in 1994. It's just that there was no transparency whatsoever. Now we came with transparency. Lastly, the issue of state intelligence. I think our mistake was to abandon everything. You don't even have your own intelligence as the ANC to know that there are people who are working within the ANC that are forming the splinter group. The issue of ageism raised by Comrade Onwaba, I think we must have a debate on this thing, because time and again it comes. But we are supposed to put it in a debate, because this attack on elderly to say they have aged, they must go home, I don't think I support that. But Comrade Onwaba, let's engage further. Thank you very much, Chair. I'm sorry if I've exceeded your 3 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, Comrade Pemi. Comrade Lindiwe.
Thank you very much, Comrade Chair. And firstly, I'd like to thank the Women's League for having picked up on this topic and to further encourage discussions around issues of international relations, because this is a topic about liberation movements, but it has a strong element of international relations, because we're talking about liberation movements around as our neighbors, as people that we struggled with and gained our freedom one by one. Second, I'd like to thank Comrade for the presentation. I really think that he didn't only just present, he actually lived his presentation. It was like he had been part and parcel of this for a very long time, not just as a young person, but Comrade Kefentse really journeyed us rightfully in how he structured the paper that he presented to us here. I'm hoping that he can be able to mobilize other young people and be able to present this paper that is presented to the ANC, to the Women's League broadly. I think this is something that also can even be presented to us as the ANC in general, not just the Women's League. But I thank him for having taken us through that journey. My third point is that I fully agree with him when he speaks about the issue of the rise and fall. The rise has always been there. We wouldn't be here if there wasn't a rise of the liberation movements who fought and made sure that all these countries in the region are free and have democracy. The fall, I think we need to really think about it carefully, because we do not want to fall into the trap of the discussions that already existed by saying, liberation movements, when they get to the year 20 or they get to year 30, they collapse. Yes, there are challenges we cannot deny. There are challenges that are related to transition from movements to governance. There are issues of ideological cohesion. There's also issues of public expectations. once the liberation movements are in government, what are the expectations by the people that they have liberated? But also it's about, do we keep the liberation agenda? Because the liberation agenda was not about just getting into power, being ministers, being this, being that. It was always about serving and changing the lives of the ordinary people. So the public expectations is something also that is important here. I also think that Comrade Kefentse raised quite critically the issue of internal dynamics and internal factionalism. We might think here in South Africa, the African National Congress, we're the only ones who are suffering from this. I just came back from Zambia for a traditional thing altogether, but the politics will always get there. They talk about the challenges of factionalism. The other issue for me, which I think Comrade Kefentse covered well, which I think we must take forward, is the issue of the benefits of liberation, talking about economic benefits and economic challenges. The liberation movements, by the way, comrades, agreed on this topic when we were in a meeting in Zimbabwe in Vic Falls, where we asked the question, are we still true to the purpose and the reason why we struggled? And we spoke about the economy, that the economies almost everywhere are not belonging to the people. And then there was an agreement there, which we should pick up, that said, can we have a discussion as liberation movements about our economies? Why are our economies not moving into the hands of our people? And also it's about the resistance that is existing, not only in South Africa, but those who own the means of production and all, they continue. That's why they are able to go to United States. And you know what? They are going to come back here to South Africa. Nothing will happen to them because there's no consequences for people who treat us this way after we've compromised so much of it. And lastly, comrades, I wish to thank Comrade Kefentse by picking up on the way forward. Usually we have these presentations and whatever, and the way forward is not there. His way forward is very clear. And I want to add to his way forward that the relationship between the liberation movements, the continued consistent engagement with the liberation movements, and also helping each other understand what we talk about, teaching each other, helping each other with best practices as liberation movements. This might be one of the things that we put as a way forward. Thank you very much, comrades. And thank you for the presentation.
Thank you, Comrade Lindiwe. Comrade Zunaid, I can see that we are being provoked now. I'll give you 2 minutes.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Sorry for that. I never knew the round, maybe make a round, second round of hands. Mine is a matter of concern. And Comrade Isaac Mkhari from my branch, keep it up. And hope to see you again at home. Mine is a matter of concern. 2027 is not far for local government election. We win forward. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So now, end of our speakers. I will hand over to you, Comrade Mkhari, to respond to the speakers.
Thank you very much, Chairperson of the session, Comrade Buiwe. Yes. Yes, thank you very much. Thank you very much to the comrades for engaging me. I'll start in reverse so that I can amplify the woman's voice more. Comrade Zunaid, definitely you will be seeing me back at home, although the responsibility that the movement has given me necessitates that I'm in Gauteng, and I'm one person. I prefer being active where I am, because the work that I'm doing is no different from the work that you're doing at home. In fact, it's a compliment. So I think we must make it a norm that comrades are active wherever they are. Not this thing of saying, I have a branch at home, but when you are where you work, you don't engage in any organizational work. So I think as a principle, it's important to be active where we are in the life of the organization. And of course, the issue of the next elections, I think maybe we would need, and I would recommend to the leadership to host another session that will speak specifically to that, because I don't think I would do justice to that question if I try to respond to it. Mamlindi Zulu, thank you very much for your compliments. I think the Women's League is the second organization I'm presenting this to. The first one was the Southern African Students Union, SASU, although we did not have enough time to present that. But I do agree that we need to share these ideas widely. And maybe one must even think of publishing some of the presentation as an opinion piece, because more and more thought on the liberation movements is diminishing, particularly in the mainstream discourse. I do agree with you, Mamlindiwe, that we need to stick to the liberation agenda. And that's why it's part of the reason why I refuse to succumb to this idea that we are former liberation movements. Because in part, we need to impress upon our organizations that you, comrades, are not, or you, as the six sister parties, are not just any other party that competes for state power for the sake of it. But there is an agenda attached to why you see state power as a vehicle towards achieving that particular agenda. So for us, the state is not the end, but it's a means to an end. You know, unlike other emerging parties who look at state power as the end, for us, state power is a means to an end, is a terrain upon which we seek to advance the national democratic revolution. And in fact, is one of the 5 pillars that are adopted as pillars for advancing the revolution. I do agree. We need to add strengthening the relationship between the liberation movements as one of the way forwards. And I think in this regard, the OR Tambo School of Leadership, as well as the Mwalimu Julius Nyerere Leadership School, as well as the individual schools within the parties, play an important role, because that strengthening of that relationship should not just be for the sake of it. It should not just be through, I do know that we do have summits of the 6 sister parties every now and then, but it should not just be for the sake of that. It should be, for example, how do we collaboratively produce think tanks, you know, using these institutions I've spoken about, so that we can begin to develop these new paradigms of development that I've spoken about, so that we can produce new thoughts entirely that would be deviating from this neoliberal, neo-colonial framework of development and political and socio-economic discourse. You know, how do we come up with research hubs that would be looking in issues of interest? How do we, the issue that Pemi Jordan raises around the issue of having the internal capacity for collecting intelligence, be it security or political intelligence, and being able to respond accordingly. It's very important, because the interference that I spoke about and the insurgency and counter-revolution, which is taking a more sophisticated and complex form, it's affecting all of us. The issues that are happening in Cabo Delgado are not just political issues that have to do with rebel groups that are fighting against the government of the day. They also have to do with weakening the liberation movements. And we are not immune to that. So it means that we need to start thinking about collaborative effort, not only at a government level, but at a party level. How do we develop our own internal intelligence services and capacities in order to intercept some of the counter-revolution that is taking place within our parties? So I think it's important that that strengthening of that relationship is not just for the sake of it, but it produces key initiatives that will help us to anticipate this decline. Comrade Penima Jordan asked a very important question. How do we characterize the recent splinter groups within our parties? I think that's a very complex question, but a very important one. When you look at how these splinter groups come about, you know, some of them come as a result of people losing congresses and opportunities to lead the organization. Some of them are, in fact, part of counter-revolution, and this is my view, because when you look at some of the groups that are actually splitting away from us and what they represent, you can see that these people, even when they were within, they did not uphold or did not believe in the principles that we believed in. They did not have the same vision that we have. In fact, one of the things that they have attempted to do is to redirect us and change our focus from what we primarily stand for to something else. But also when you check the issue of funding, where the funding comes from, and this is where this issue of having internal intelligence capacities and capabilities is important, so that we can be able to characterize these splinter groups and even some of the people who are still working within the organization, because we must not take it for granted that this foreign interference and counter-revolution also finds expression within the rank and file of the movements itself. How do we clean ourselves up and rid ourselves from those counter-revolutionary elements? So I think it's a very important question that I think requires a session on its own to say, how do we characterize counter-revolution at this point in time in South Africa? I mean, for example, I've alluded to the fact that if we simply take this migration issue as an innocent issue, we're going to have problems. We need to be able to analyze it correctly and be able to find counter-revolutionary elements of the influx of immigrants that are in South Africa. For example, if you check the issue that has to do with the correlation between this influx of immigrants and lawlessness in South Africa, it can't be an automatic issue. I believe, and I firmly believe, that there is some counter-revolutionary deliberate efforts that are undertaken that are attached to this. This is not to say all immigrants are part of counter-revolutionary forces, no. But I'm saying that element is there, and I don't think we've fully understood it and comprehended both at a party level and at a government level, in as far as we speak about our security apparatus. Indeed, the role of women, and I did make this disclaimer as disclaimer number 3, that unfortunately I would not be elevating the role of women, but I do agree with you, and I've already made that plea, that the role of women has to be heightened in our liberation politics. And I was glad that Comrade Nomantu, when she was making an introduction, she did make reference to that I think in the near future, they're going to invite Mampa Tabile to come and speak about the role of women in the liberation struggle entirely, not just in the MK, but entirely, because women have played a significant role. If you look at the role they played, for example, in diplomacy and international solidarity, it's a huge role. The support they were able to help us mobilize from the international community, whether through their arts, through their advocacy, through their activism and diplomacy, it's huge. But unfortunately, that work is not well documented. And if it's documented, it's marginalized. So I think it's the role of the ANC Women's League working with the ANC entirely and the broader mass democratic movement to start collecting that data and start producing that literature, so that we can actually be able to mainstream the role of women, even in terms of the creative industry. How do we reignite some of those roles? When are we going to have a film that speaks about the role Mam Charlotte Maxeke played in the liberation struggle? A film that is dedicated to her. It's funded by the state, it's funded by us, it's produced by progressive producers who can come up with a proper reignite or a biopic that will, be able to bring her contribution to the struggle to the fore and socialize it. Comrade Tumelo Pito speaks about the issue of constitutional democracy. I do agree with everything that you've said. One point I want to make on this issue of constitutional democracy is that unfortunately, the constitution can be used as a tool to advance transformation or as a tool to anticipate transformation or to strong-arm it. There are some people who are hell-bent on using the constitution to actually anticipate transformation. That's why you have a lot of political debates being settled in the courts. So that's point number one. Point number two is that I think as the movement, one of the challenges that we need to respond to is that oftentimes when we speak about constitutionalism, we emphasize more on the Bill of Rights. And when we speak about the Bill of Rights, we speak about the rights that are contained within the Constitution, but speak very little about the responsibilities therein, because these two go hand in hand. And what has happened over time is because we emphasize a lot on the rights, rightfully so, because we come from a history that did not guarantee us those rights. People feel they have the right to do anything, even if it's inimical to what the Constitution itself is trying to achieve. And I think we need to, in our rhetoric, in our lexicon, in our theory, emphasize the fact that there are responsibilities. The only way we can sustain the guarantee of these rights is if we all do what we're supposed to do in terms of those particular responsibilities. Just to emphasize this point, one of the things we need to do in order to amplify our voice in terms of emphasizing the right, we need to ask ourselves, what is the society's, in particular the motive forces psychology, or the underpinning psychology that they must adopt in order for us to advance the national democratic revolution? Because sometimes the way society behaves, the psyche of society, South African society, it's inimical to what the NDR is trying to achieve. And I think we need to labor to produce a different kind of psychology, a different kind of South African at a psychological level that will be aligned with what we're trying to achieve in the NDR. Because the pillars of advancing the struggle is not just the state. What is the psyche of us cultural activists and the messaging that they are producing? What is the psychology of young people entirely? And I think Tanzania offers the best example in this regard. If you look at how President Julius Nyerere was able, through the Ujamaa philosophy, impress upon the consciousness of society that you need to embody a particular psychology for us to achieve the things that we want to achieve. For example, if you ask a South African today, what is your psychological relationship with land? You're going to get many different answers. And that's why, for example, when we go to land claims and restitution cases, people opt for money instead of land. Because I don't think at a psychological level we've done enough to prepare them to say, this is the psychology that we need to embody as it relates to land. What is our psychological relationship with education, right? It's not this thing where I just get a degree and I pride myself and therefore become part of the elite. But there needs to be a different progressive psychology to say, I must go to school so that I can enhance my capability to serve the people and to serve the nation. And in this regard, that's where even patriotism is going to come across. I do agree, Comrade Puitso, that we need to do things differently, go back to the people if you want to regain. And that's why we speak about the issue of renewal. Lastly, Comrade Umrabulo, I agree with some of the things that you have said, particularly as it relates to lack of patriotism and deindustrialization. And this speaks again to what I've just said, that we need to adopt a different psychology, both at a political level, at a social level, also at an intellectual level, so that we're able to produce new frames of new paradigms, new frameworks of development, new paradigms of what do we consider as development. For example, there are some people today, they don't believe the fact that we offer young people meals at school. That's a significant way of combating poverty and increasing literacy rates. Because as a product of a school that had a feeding scheme, I can tell you for free that for some kids, that is the only and last meal that they have for the day. And that's why even our teachers allowed us to bring iskaftin from home so that we can take some of the leftovers back at home, because they understand that we come from disadvantaged backgrounds where it may not just be you who has not eaten, but the entire family may have not had a meal to eat. And in this neoliberal conception of development, that is a menial issue. But we have to say, no, but that is not a menial issue. It's a very significant progress. It's a very significant issue in as far as our development measures are concerned, or developmental measures are concerned. Of course, you problematize the Roman Dutch law. I'm not an expert of jurisprudence, but I know this question has been contentious for quite some time. What I would say is that I do agree that we need to look at the impact of neo-colonialism in as far as it affects our superstructure, and therefore the base upon which that superstructure is based, to say what is the influence of things such as the Roman Dutch law, the curriculum content of our education, and the many other things that I've spoken about. Well, of course, the issues of deportations, I guess that's why at some point we had to resort to other means. You know, if you look at the transformation in the ANC from the 1940s, we started adopting mass mobilization, defiance campaigns, the program of action of 1949, and the 4 pillars of struggle that came out of that, and then the formation of Umkhonto weSizwe. That was really the struggle evolving, right? So at the time, perhaps it may have made sense, but as time went, comrades realized that we need to do more. You know, so I think we need to fully appreciate the evolution of liberation in South Africa, and in this regard, I would really impress upon, as I conclude, comrades, to take up courses on the ANC Foundation course, because you will get a clear sense of how the struggle evolved, some of the challenges that were encountered at each epoch, and how we were able to overcome those challenges. But more importantly, significant lessons that must help us with our renewal agenda, because we have been through many phases of renewal. The formation of the ANC itself signifies a renewal where people no longer fought colonization or colonialism in their tribes, in their small groups, but decided to come together. When you look at 1923, when you look at 1940s under the presidency of A.B. Xuma, so there are many lessons in the history of the ANC that we can learn that can help us navigate the challenges of the time. So in conclusion, I really impress upon comrades to go to their branches, and take up ANC Foundation courses. After that, come to the school, take up the courses we offer, because really all we need we are trying to do is heighten our political consciousness and say progressive politics are still valid politics. The fact that neoliberalism and its dominance has impressed upon a society a particular consciousness, it does not mean that our progressive thinking should be relegated to the annals of history. It must be brought back, and from a common standard of consciousness, we must then be able to propel society forward in as far as our transformation agenda is concerned. Thank you very much, Chair, and I do apologize if I've taken too much of the time.
Thank you, Comrade Kefentse. As we are closing, I would also emphasize, take up what you've requested from us, that let's all go to our branches and take up the course, the foundation course, please, comrades. On that note, again, I want to thank you, Comrade Kefentse. And at this point in time, I will give to our convener, Comrade Nomantu, to do the closing remarks.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Comrade Voi. And thanks, Comrade. Thanks, Comrade Kefentse Mkhari. Thanks, Mkhari, because you really made a very good presentation, and we'll definitely get some those lights, and we share them with the comrades. Good thing that you have touched on, which I am sure when we call you back again, in the because I still believe that we will still need another session. But again, when we get that session, then we do some additional fields in terms of what are the other issues that we need to know. And perhaps I think we should have an agreement and understanding of what each word means first, on the words that we spoke about, in terms of rise. If you say rise, you mean to move from a lower position to a higher position, just an ordinary dictionary pronunciation. Then fall, when you fall is to move from a higher position to a lower position. But again, when we talk about then that rise and fall of a liberation movement is the action of setting someone free, isn't it? And again, you talk about the movement at the same time. It's a rise and fall of a movement, which means it's a political organized group of people seeking to change or transform policy, which is social values or a given status at that particular time. But ours then now in this topic was clear that we're talking about Southern Africa and which is southernmost of Africa. So, which means it's not only one country, it's a number of countries that we will definitely need at some stage to talk about, including our country, South Africa, which we have its own contested and accepted names between. We remember at some stage there are those that used to call it Azania, and some will say South Africa, because it was colonized at that particular time. And there's a lot of literature again around these areas, which at some stage we will need to make sure that the nature of those colonization we face, there are amongst other things that when we do these political education sessions, we discuss about them. Then why I was saying, Kari, we will need you, it's because again, at the same time, we still need to have a discussion that talks about our liberation movements, if they are still there, those liberation movements. And if there are those movements, where are they existing? And how do you say this one is existing and this one is not existing? And is there any common understanding and solidarity perspective that used to be there? And I think Comrade Lindy will be the witness on this issue of solidarity. Because already we are still talking about the solidarity that we must do based on the countries sometimes that we used to work with them at that particular time. But we need to tease it out then and say, which are the countries now that we can still claim that we are working with them and we have this solidarity amongst them? And what are those features that those countries will have. So there are those questions that we will definitely ask and make sure that we clear them once we have another session with yourself. And I'm quite confident that most of the comrades have observed and analyzed the situation that we're doing in terms even of balancing and the balance of forces that are domestic and regional, including international, picking up on some of the issues that you are raising. And I'm happy that you did accept our invitation, and we will definitely talk to you again. We are part of us as we are part of OR Tambo Political School, but you'll be assisting us even in some of the political education sessions that we'll be doing as the Women's League, because we have spread our wings. We have even now Umrabulo, it's either it's Sunday or whatever day that the regions, that the provinces are doing of the Women's League. So we will definitely invite you once again. But on this one, which is a national one, I will have a session with you and you guide us which areas you think will help us as the Women's League, and touching again on the role of women in this particular area. And even, by the way, making references to the countries, because we're not the only country that women are always left behind, but we need to make references about that. And out of those references, we need to come up with a way forward that says, how do we then emerge as women and make sure that we are not left behind? As we always say, no one must be left behind. We were left behind. We tried to cover up, still very difficult, but we need to make sure that then we say, in our lifetime, no woman must be left behind. Once again, thank you so much, Kimvi. We really appreciate what we have done, the educational program that you gave us today. Thank you, comrades, to everyone that have logged in, including those that I know they wish to log in, but will definitely circulate the document from Comrade Mkhari so that people can benefit. Thank you.
Malbongwe.